Hey everybody, welcome back to Wednesday Night Bible Class. My name is Dr. Jones. I am a doctor, but I'm not, but I am. So we're back, and today we're going to get into the actual exile. We're actually going to get into the exile. And how we're going to do that is we're going to do it through the eyes of Ezekiel the prophet. Ezekiel is the 26th book in the Old Testament. It is one of the prophets' writings. So if you remember, we have the Old Testament kind of split up into three categories. We had the law, which is the Torah. Then we had the writings, and then we had the prophets. Now, the writings are like the Psalms, the Proverbs, Songs of Solomon. And then we have the prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then what they call the minor prophets. Ezekiel is one of the major prophets, and we're going to look at exile through his eyes. Ezekiel was a priest, but he never served as a priest because he was taken captive during the reign of King Jehoiakim. He was taken captive into exile during that reign, so he never got the chance to serve as priest. But he was a prophet, and he had some serious visions during the exile. Most notably is the Valley of the Dry Bones. That was Ezekiel. Everybody has heard of the Valley of the Dry Bones. Dry bones. Who can put these dry bones together? If anyone can do it, Lord, you can. So that was Ezekiel. He was also kind of, well, people saw him as kind of cuckoo because he did some things that God told him to do, and it looked cuckoo to the people. But he did what God told him to do. And so it turns out that Ezekiel was one of the captives that was brought down to the rivers of Babylon. If you remember one of our earlier lessons, we talked about how the Bible began to take shape in exile. And we talked about how Psalm 137 gives us a glimpse or a look at like the where, the why, the how the Bible began to take shape. Psalm 137 says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, and we remembered Zion." So recall that from a way earlier, like probably the first lesson that we did is when we talked about that psalm. So you can go check that video out. But yes, so Ezekiel was one of those taken captive during the second deportation, and he was taken with that group of people that were taken down to the rivers of Babylon. So while they were writing that, whole "by the rivers of Babylon, there we wept," Ezekiel at the same time was writing Ezekiel 1:1, "The heavens were opened and I saw visions of God." So we're going to look at exile through the eyes of Ezekiel, who got these visions from God, did some crazy stuff. One of the things that Ezekiel is known for is during the first years of captivity, there were a lot of false prophets coming and saying that Jerusalem would not be destroyed. Because remember, Jeremiah had said that Jerusalem would be destroyed, and Ezekiel confirmed this. So these false prophets were saying that Jerusalem would not be destroyed and the people would be returned to Jerusalem and all would be okay. So now that the Jerusalem wasn't destroyed for the first 10 years. So the exile started, it actually started in 597 BC, and Jerusalem wasn't destroyed until about 586 BC. So the first deportation happened in 597, and then there was a second deportation, and then there was the final third deportation. For about 10 years, these false prophets were telling everybody that, everybody's going to be returned back home. Jerusalem's not going to be destroyed. Ezekiel came in and he confirmed what Jeremiah said, which is that Jerusalem would be destroyed. So he was a little crazy in his method. Jesus spoke in a lot of parables, and the people spoke in parables. That was a thing. Instead of speaking in parables, Ezekiel acted them out, and God told him to do this, and he did it. Ezekiel's acting out what God told him to do was like a demonstration of what all the people were feeling and what all the people were going through during this exilic period. So yeah, he looked cuckoo. He did. Just envisioning it, he looked cuckoo, but it's a visual of how the people were feeling during that time. So instead of me talking, why don't we get right into it?
The conquest of Jerusalem by Babylonia actually took place in several stages, even though we tend to focus on the date of 586 BCE as the fall of Jerusalem. In 597, 10 years before that fall, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and removed King Jehoiakim from the throne. He placed Zedekiah, the uncle of Jehoiakim, on the throne as a puppet king. He then deported the elite to Babylonia. This first group of deportees included King Jehoiakim and his family, the Jerusalem priests and scribes, and the nobles. In 588, after Zedekiah dared to rebel against Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem and laid siege to the city for 2 years. Then we learn that the nightmare that was so often associated with siege had occurred as the city was gripped with famine. Zedekiah and what he had left of his army in the city broke through a hole in the city's wall and attempted an escape by night. But he was ultimately captured and brought before Nebuchadnezzar. His punishment was severe. His children were killed before his eyes, and then his own eyes were gouged out, and he was carried into exile. A second group of Judeans was taken into exile at this time. Since the elite had already gone, this second group consisted of a broader spectrum of the population. The Bible records 3 destinations for exiles. Jeremiah and several others stayed in Judah, but were ultimately forced to flee to Egypt. Still others, those that the Bible refers to as the poorest of the land, were left in Judah. They do not experience exile, and in the absence of priests, they continued to offer sacrifices in the ruined Jerusalem temple.
Which is fascinating.
Finally, a significant portion of the population was taken to Babylonia, where they were settled together in a few cities along a river called Kabar in the southern part of Babylonia. The Babylonians, as we have noted, had a different deportation policy from the Assyrians. While the Assyrians had scattered the exiles in multiple cities, the Babylonians settled the exiled people together, where they could maintain their language, culture, and religious practices. This change in deportation policy allowed for the survival of Judah as a nation, and in so doing, it made possible the creation and preservation of texts that would become the Bible. In this lecture, I will focus on Ezekiel, an eyewitness to the Babylonian conquest and a first-person informant on the experience of the Babylonian exile. The book of Ezekiel begins by introducing Ezekiel as a priest and the son of Butzi. It also signals that he is a prophet when it claims that Ezekiel saw visions of God and that the word of the Lord came to him and the hand of the Lord was upon him. If you read the whole book of Ezekiel, you'll come away with the impression that this man was intensely creative, theologically sophisticated, and quite possibly emotionally unbalanced.
Which the book of Ezekiel is long. So what I find helps is going through these lessons with Dr. Chapman, and then, getting like the overall, the gist of the book, and then going back to the book and reading it helps to give a better understanding, because I think it's like 48 chapters long. It's long. So my suggestion would be, after we finish going through this lecture with Dr. Chapman, then go back to the book of Ezekiel and read through it. I guarantee it's going to be easier.
His prophetic career spans 30 years, from 593 to 563 BCE. According to his own report, he was part of that first deportation of Judean elites to Babylon.
Okay, that's my bad. I thought he was part of the second group. But clearly Dr. Chapman knows more than I do, so we're going to go with him being part of the first group.
Babylonia in 597 BCE. And it was in Babylonia that he first began to have visions and speak the prophetic word. The book that bears the prophet's name contains many oracles and pronouncements that likely go back to the prophet himself, but it also clearly contains material that post-dates the prophet. In general, the book can be divided into 3 historical periods, each one defined by a central concern. Chapters 1 through 24 contain a series of warnings concerning the disaster that is about to befall Jerusalem. These can be dated between 593 and 586 BCE, so before the fall of Jerusalem. Chapters 25 to 32, usually called the Oracles Against Foreign Nations, contain a series of judgments against the nations directly involved in Judah's conquest, or those that stood by and celebrated Judah's conquest. Chapters 33 through 48 contain visions of hope and restoration for the people of Judah in their homeland, complete with a rebuilt temple. Even though Ezekiel was a priest, a member of the Jerusalem elite, much of what he experienced and prophesied about applied to the lives of all Judeans who experienced the horror of the Babylonian conquest. In the 5th year of his exile in Babylonia, Ezekiel begins to see visions of the Israelite God and to hear oracles that he is to deliver to the house of Israel. The visions that he experiences during this time of exile, prior to the actual fall of Jerusalem, are permeated with violence, depravity, death, and destruction. From the very beginning, his prophetic task is tied up with his personal life. One of the first things that happens to him is that he's struck dumb by God. But his incapacity to speak is selective and purposeful. God tells him that he will make his tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth so that Ezekiel will be unable to warn what God considers to be a rebellious and unrepentant house of Israel. But he will not be completely unable to speak. The Israelite God will loose his tongue only to enable him to speak oracles of doom against Judah and Jerusalem. Ezekiel's selective dumbness lasts for about 7 years until he receives word that Jerusalem has fallen. Ezekiel also loses his wife while in exile and is told by God that he may not observe the customary mourning rites for her. The Israelite God addresses Ezekiel and says, "I am about to take the delight of your eyes away from you at a stroke. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead."
So let me jump in here and say this real quick. This may not sit well with some people. It's like, what did Ezekiel do? And there are some things that occur that don't necessarily sit well with me either. I do understand, however, that God needed to make an example of Ezekiel for the people. And I don't see Ezekiel complaining about being that example, so I'm not going to complain for him. The people were rebellious. As you recall from the last video that we did and from multiple videos that we've done, God specifically tells them don't worship other gods, don't have any other idols, and they consistently continue to do that. And even in the last video, they went so far as to say, when Jeremiah was telling them that, they need to cut all this out, they're like, nope, we're not going to cut all this out. We're going to continue to worship the Queen of Heaven who was an Assyrian goddess. We're going to continue to do this stuff that God told us not to do, that his prophet, is telling us not to do. We're going to continue to do this. And so the people were rebellious, and God had to teach them. And so he used Ezekiel as an example. It reminds me of something else that I thought that was unfair that happened back with Moses. And if you remember, the people were thirsty, and so God told Moses to strike the rock once. Moses was so angry with the people that he struck the rock twice. And because of that, Moses couldn't go into the promised land. And for years, that didn't sit well with me, because it's like, Moses was one of the greatest, ever. And so it was like, really, he can't go into the promised land for because he struck the rock twice. When we get to the New Testament, we will find out why that was such a big deal. He was only supposed to strike the rock once, and why striking it twice was such a big deal. So a lot of times there are things that we're going to see God doing that may seem unfair to our human eyes. But we trust God, and Moses didn't complain about his punishment, and Ezekiel isn't complaining about his punishment. So when we see things like this, we recognize it for, it looks like it's unfair. But I'm pretty sure Moses and Ezekiel knew a lot more then, especially about God, than we do today. So if they're not complaining about it, I'm not going to complain about it.
Again, Ezekiel's personal experience of the loss of his wife becomes a symbol for the entire nation's loss of many loved ones. When Ezekiel explains to the exiles why he's not observing the mourning rites for his wife, he tells them that God is preparing to destroy his sanctuary, the delight of the people's eyes. And in that destruction, the exiles' sons and daughters, those that they were forced to leave behind, would fall by the sword. Those who are already in exile, when they hear the news of the death of their sons and daughters, will not be allowed to mourn for them. They will be left to sigh and moan, but appropriate mourning rites will not be allowed. Ezekiel also engages in a series of sign acts, what we might call today performance art. He physically enacts what siege, conquest, and deportation will mean for his people. In chapter 4, God tells Ezekiel to take a brick and draw a picture of Jerusalem on it. And then, somewhere publicly, where others can see him, he's supposed to lay the brick down and begin building siege works against it, and setting up enemy camps around it, and many battering rams arrayed against it. He's then told to lie first on his left side, facing the city for 390 days, symbolizing the number of years that Israel will endure the Lord's punishment. He's then told to switch to his right side and face the city for another 40 days, representing the number of years that Judah will endure punishment. If you have a study Bible, the scholarly notes for this chapter tell us the actual performance of this command seems most unlikely. Ezekiel's physical
So I've never read that in any of my study Bibles. It's not in here, but I do have this. Ooh. I do have this that I got off of Amazon, which is like a commentary to the entire book of Ezekiel. I have a bunch of these. I'm going to get more, but these are really good, by Dr. John Vernon McGee. He's really good. Let me read what he says about that section. His take on it is very interesting to me. This is in Ezekiel chapter 4. Thou shalt also take unto thee wheat and barley and beans and lentils and millet, okay, blah, 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 according to the number of days that thou shalt lie upon thy side, 390 days shalt thou eat thereof. Okay, so he's going to lay there 390 days and he's going to eat all this stuff. So now, John Vernon McGee's commentary, or his note on this, says, these instructions would be overwhelming to most of us. They were especially difficult for Ezekiel to follow because he was a priest and had never eaten anything unclean. However, this was to be a sign from the Lord of the famine the people would experience at the time of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Despite the continued promises of the false prophets, the city and the people were going to be lost. These various signs describe the horrors that were to come. So he doesn't necessarily take the opinion, or I don't know, in his commentary, he doesn't necessarily take the opinion that Ezekiel probably didn't do this. But I have heard some people say he probably didn't. Some people say he probably did. But what I will say is this. It seems to me, and I am no one, it seems to me that when you read the verses that are tied into this 390 days, it's talking about him eating. So what I wonder is maybe he laid there while he ate. Because he was acting out this specific thing that had to do with famine that would come to the land. So maybe he was just laying there while he was eating just to act that out. I mean, I can't really see somebody how would you live if you lay there all day, every day? I don't know. I am of the thought that perhaps when he ate, he would lay down and eat this way for 390 days. But I don't know.
Ezekiel's physical enactment of siege, however, moves beyond lying on his side for long periods of time. We also have a story where he is commanded to ration his food, measuring out minuscule portions and eating a combination of grains that would indicate that he's scraping the bottom of all the food supply jars in order to throw together a mixed gruel. In chapter 5, God tells Ezekiel to chop off all his hair with a sword. Ezekiel does this, and then he divides his hair in 3 piles in order to predict the depth of loss and destruction that the Judeans would experience under the Babylonians. He sets fire to 1 pile of his hair, and he hacks a 2nd pile repeatedly with the sword, and a 3rd pile he gathers up in his hands and hurls it to the wind, scattering it.
Can y'all just imagine that? Like, take yourself back in the day and imagine one of your prophets out in the street doing this. Y'all remember that video of King David dancing? I'm gonna see if I can find a rendering of Ezekiel the prophet doing this, because we see people on the street doing some crazy stuff. To see this back in the day, that would have been some crazy stuff.
He has a bit of a penchant for drama. And finally, in chapter 12, God commands Ezekiel to enact the life of an exile. He has to pack a small bag and carry it around with him throughout the city to show the inhabitants what it will be like when they are carried off. Every action of Ezekiel's life becomes a sign for the people of the devastation that will come to Jerusalem when it finally falls to Babylonia. Even though Ezekiel is an elite priest and a bizarre character, he nonetheless captures many of the mundane horrors of living through war. One of these horrors shows Ezekiel's concern for a lack of proper burial. Piles of corpses, many dismembered and mutilated, would be scattered in the streets, on the city walls, and outside the city. Some of the dead would be seen impaled on stakes. Not being able to bury their loved ones would have added to the experience of trauma and loss that the exiles experienced as they were led out of their devastated cities. Throughout the Bible, the lack of a proper burial constitutes a curse and a punishment. The Bible associates gruesome death and lack of burial with sinful, cursed people. Burial caves that have been excavated in the Central Highlands have a narrow opening that leads into a rectangular room with up to 3 benches, 1 on each side and across the back. It's as if once a person died, he or she moved to a different type of house, a house shared by all the ancestors who had gone before. So returning to Ezekiel and his many visions of death and destruction, he was clearly speaking to a central concern of the exiles. These exiles had to have asked themselves, what happened to our loved ones that we had to leave behind unburied on the streets and hillsides of Judah. And here is where we can turn to another section of the book of Ezekiel, the section that focuses on restoration. There we find his famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. In chapter 37, the Israelite God picks up Ezekiel and drops him in a valley filled with dry bones. These bones are a metaphor for the exiles themselves who have lost hope in ever returning to their homeland. In the vision, God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? To which Ezekiel answers, only you know. Then Ezekiel is told to prophesy to the bones. O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. What follows is a fantastical vision in which the bones are connected one to another, forming full skeletons. Then flesh and sinews grow over the bones. Finally, God commands the wind to breathe into the bones, and Ezekiel reports, the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great host. This living, breathing host is meant to give hope to the exiles that they will live again as a mighty nation in their own land. By the 2nd century BCE, some segments within the Judean population had developed a belief in the resurrection of the dead. Now, it's hard to know whether this vision of revivified, dried bones is an early...
Did she just say revivified? Revivified?
The articulation of that shift in belief. We began this course reciting Psalm 137, an exilic psalm, in which captive Judeans ask, how can we sing the Lord's song in a land that is not our own? We also mentioned that one of the questions that arose after the conquest of the northern kingdom, and again after the conquest of the southern kingdom, was how were we defeated? A longer version of this question would go something like, if our God is all powerful and we are his chosen covenantal people, why didn't our God protect us from our enemies? Ezekiel's visions provide answers to both of these questions. In the opening vision of the book of Ezekiel, the prophet sits among the exiles by the river Kabar and receives a visitation from the Israelite God. The heavens open up, and Ezekiel sees a chariot of sorts with the same iconography that we associate with the Ark of the Covenant. 4 strange beings with wings power the vehicle. Each had 4 faces and calves' hoofs. Most significantly, this vehicle had wheels, strange spinning wheels with eyes. Sitting enthroned on this winged wheeled chariot, Ezekiel beholds his God. But his description of this God shows his reticence in describing the deity outright. He sees what he calls a likeness, as it were, of a human form. He sees the likeness of the appearance of the glory of the Lord. What this first vision communicates is that the Israelite God has gotten himself a set of wheels. In the face of conquest and destruction, he's become mobile. The fact that he appears to Ezekiel in exile says that this is a God who can travel. So the first exilic question has been partially answered. How can we sing the Lord's song in a land that is not our own? You can sing the Lord's song because the Lord is with you. He is present with you in exile. The second question is the how question. How could we have been conquered if our God is all powerful? Ezekiel's answer to this question comes in chapter 8 of his book. God appears to him again, the same enthroned deity mounted on a fantastic wheeled flying chariot. This vision is dated to 592, before the final conquest of Jerusalem. This time the deity grabs Ezekiel by the hair, lifts him up in order to transport him back to Jerusalem, where he receives a guided tour of the temple where he once served as priest. On this tour, he sees Israelite elders and priests burning incense to idols in the Jerusalem temple's courtyard. Women were engaged in a ritual weeping for the foreign god called Tammuz. Inside the temple itself, men have turned their backs on the Holy of Holies, the footstool of the Israelite god, and instead they face the doorway to the east in order to worship the sun god. After the Israelite god has shown Ezekiel all the defiling foreign practices that the Israelites are engaged in within his own temple, Ezekiel sees his God vacate his throne in the Holy of Holies above the cherubim and stand on the threshold of the temple. What Ezekiel sees is the exit of his God. While pausing at the threshold of his temple, the deity gives the command to his emissaries to smite and burn any person engaged in these foreign worship practices, but to spare those who were not. When this purging is complete, Ezekiel sees his God mount his chariot and depart from his temple and his city. This divine departure answers the second exilic question: how is it that we were conquered if we are the covenantal partners of an all-powerful God? The answer that Ezekiel's vision provides is that the Jerusalem temple had become so polluted with the foreign worship practices associated with other gods that it was no longer a suitable dwelling place for the Israelite God. And so, like Ezekiel, this God must pack his bag and head into exile. And when the Israelite God vacates his temple and abandons the city of Jerusalem, he leaves it vulnerable to foreign attack and conquest. Jerusalem fell because the Israelite God was no longer there. Jerusalem fell because the Judeans had made the temple of their God an unfit abode for him. As a prophet, priest, and Judean, Ezekiel experienced the conquest and exile firsthand. Theologically, one of his most significant contributions was to give the Israelite God wheels, and in so doing, allow for the worship of this God in exile. This development will prove crucial to the development of Judaism as a diaspora religion, no longer focused on sacrifice in a temple and no longer tied to the Judean homeland.
Let's do a quick recap, shall we? So we have Ezekiel, who was deported in the first deportation. So there were 3 deportations into exile. Ezekiel was a part of the first deportation. He was amongst the group of people that were taken down by the rivers of Babylon. Apparently the Kabar River is where they were dropped off and settled as a group. In the first 10 or so years, there were false prophets that were coming up, and they were telling the people, Jerusalem will not be conquered. We're all going to go back to our home in Judah. Don't worry about it. All these false prophets were telling the people this. Ezekiel combated this by confirming what Jeremiah had already prophesied, which was that no, you're going into exile and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So Ezekiel came in and confirmed that when he started prophesying. One of the ways that he prophesied to the people was to act out his prophecies. He acted out the siege. He acted out the famine that was to come. He acted out the 3 ways that the people were going to fall. First of all, he shaved his head, which was something that priests did not do. Then he chopped his hair into 3 sections. The first section he burned, which represented the people who were going to be destroyed by fire and destruction. The second pile he hacked repeatedly, which represented the people who were going to live through the siege, what was going to become of them. The third pile, he took it and scattered into the wind, which was going to represent the third group of the exiles who were going to be spread all over the diaspora. And then there was the last portion, which was to represent the remnant. Like there was a portion of his hairs that he was supposed to attach to his garment, and those represented the remnant. So he had this strange way of prophesying. But what I think is most fascinating about looking at this is the fact that Ezekiel answered the questions that the exiles had, that we looked at, that we started out with at the beginning of this series, which was in Psalm 137. The questions that were answered were, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That question was answered by Ezekiel because Ezekiel's vision showed that God was mobile and that God moved around, and that wherever the people went, God would go with them. So how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? You can sing a song in a foreign land because he's there with you. That to me is it's so fascinating. Now, what I wish would have happened is so the Bible is a history book, but it's not necessarily in order. It's not written in order. Well, not all of it. Not all of it is written in order. So it's kind of, without actually studying this, it's hard to know that Ezekiel is answering Psalm 137. So this is why we're studying. This is why we're doing this. The second question that Ezekiel answers for the people is, how are we conquered if our God is almighty and all powerful and the one? How were we conquered? Ezekiel answers this by the vision of God taking him by the hair and taking him to the temple. And he sees the temple and it's just defiled. It's like it's overrun with all these idols. God has left the building. Like, he is tired of y'all. First of all, he's telling the people over and over again, stop with the idol worship. Stop with all these idols. And they don't listen. So the temple is no longer a suitable place for God to be. So he leaves, of course. What that makes me think of as a Christian, and knowing that my body is God's temple, it makes me really, really think about how I could be defiling the temple. Of course, that's something we'll get into when we get to the New Testament, but it goes all the way back to the Old Testament. You know how in the New Testament, it talks about the Old Testament being for our learning. Well, this is one of those things that tie them together. So like, our bodies are the temple. The temple was the temple. They defiled the temple so much that God couldn't dwell there. He could not be there. So he left. Just consider that today as a Christian, knowing that your body is the temple of God. Just consider that. And then finally, it's fascinating to me, and we will get into this in the in-between period. Once we get done with the Old Testament, we're going to cover the in-between period, and then we're going to go to the New Testament. The in-between period being that 400 years of silence. So it's interesting to me that Dr. Chapman pointed out how when the Israelites realized that God was mobile, this is sort of like and we'll look at this more when we get into the in-between period. Was this like a precursor to, we don't need the temple anymore? God is mobile. We no longer need to make sacrifices in the temple. Was this a precursor to that? I mean, it could have been. But then again, if it actually really started back then, back when they were taken captive into Babylon, why would they rebuild the temple? Why would they see the need to rebuild the temple? When we get to that in-between period, that's going to be quite fascinating. That was really, really good. That was really good. Because whenever we talk about Ezekiel, the thing we talk about is the valley of the dry bones. But like in context, it means so much more. Ezekiel was there in exile, talking about the pre, the during, the post. Just amazing. So now I want everybody to go back and read Ezekiel chapter 1 through 48. That's a lot. It's a lot. You don't have to do it all in one day. You don't have to do it all in 1 week. But now that we have like this context, reading it is going to be a lot smoother, and we get to have a better understanding. So I mean, all this stuff is just fascinating. So we're not done with exile yet. The next class we're going to be looking into actual life in exile, which I can't wait to get to. What questions do you have? What questions do you have about Ezekiel? Are you all familiar with the Valley of the Dry Bones? Like, is that something that you guys hear a lot? Like, whenever I hear about Ezekiel, that's all I would hear about was the dry bones. That's it. But no context. No context. Now we understand exactly what that is, exactly what that's doing, the question that answers exactly, and that makes me excited. If you are as excited as I am, probably not, because this stuff it's so fascinating to me. Is it not fascinating? It's just so fascinating to me. So if you're as excited about this as I am, please give the video a thumbs up. Please share the video to someone that you think may be excited like we are. All the YouTube things. Please subscribe to the channel. Please come back next week for our next class.